Alright, welcome back everybody. So this will be the final game we're going to go over in this series, and it's a very different game from all the other ones we've gone over because in this game white actually castles kingside. Now this is more or less not the scope of our standard series here on attacking the Sicilian, but I think that this is an important one to include as well because it's a game that comes out of the Sveshnikov Variation, which is really the only line of the Sicilian that white really just doesn't have the option to castle queenside. So it starts with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. And now after knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight c3, black immediately plays e5. So by doing this, black is really gaining some time for development. He's hitting this knight on d4 with a threat, but what he's neglected is the weaknesses on the d5 and d6 scores. So this basically forces white to play a more positional game. So after knight b5, which in theory would threaten to invade on d6, black plays d6 to stop the white knight from invading. And if white were to just do a sort of a standard English attack here, after something like bishop e3, a6, the knight's relegated all the way back to a3, and after b5, b4 is threatened, and white is nowhere near being able to set up his standard English attack. Black certainly has other options than b5 as well, but in general, bishop e3 doesn't quite make sense here. And similarly, if we were to retreat the knight to b3 in this position, which would be kind of like an English attack, after bishop e3, say f3, bishop e7, bishop e3, white will play queen d2, castle long, and play with g4 and h4. This would be a standard English attack. But because black has left his d-pawn on d7, as opposed to the knight or for the Sveshnikov where he plays the d6 very quickly, after knight b3, black has the move bishop b4 available, which normally is not an option because the d6 pawn is in the way. And oftentimes bishop b4 isn't so great because after black plays d6, the bishop will be kind of trapped on b4 and will often have to exchange itself for the knight on c3, which is generally unfavorable. But concretely, this just doesn't quite work out for white because the e4 pawn is hanging, and after it's defended after, like say, bishop d3, black can immediately break with d5 and open up the center and equalize handily. So as a result, in the Sveshnikov, white more or less is forced to castle kingside. So this is the one time we're going to castle kingside in our series. So knight d to b5, d6. Instead of bishop e3, white plays a much more positional game with bishop g5, hoping to pin this knight on f6 and relinquish its control over the d5 square. And white's just hoping to put this knight on d5 and have a really nice position. So if black were to just develop normally after some bishop takes d5, or bishop takes f6, excuse me, bishop takes, now the d6 pawn is hanging, and if g takes f6, knight d5, this is a positional catastrophe. So black really needs to start with the move a6. And white retreats the knight to a3, and now b5. So white's main move here is knight d5, but Anand captured on f6, which I approve of, because this is an attacking series, and we're trying to attack. In this case, black has a choice between taking with the queen, which would give white a lot of extra time after a move like knight to d5, queen back to d8, and already white can consider moves like bishop takes b5. Looking to sacrifice, and after takes, the white knight is very much ready to come into c7, and the black king is not in the best of spots. Of course, white can play more positionally as well, but this costs black a lot of time, and we're not as concerned about this element of the bishop pair as we are about time. So black, quite naturally in this game, takes with the pawn to save time, not have to worry about that. And after knight d5, we see black's main positional consideration. His opinion is that this knight on d5 is the best minor piece on the board, but the knight on a3 is the worst minor piece on the board. So he's hoping to prove that the knight on a3 being bad will compensate for the knight on d5 being good. However, the white knight on a3 certainly has a route back into the game. When white plays c3, the knight will come to c2 and then potentially e3. So bishop g7 is played by Radjabov. By the way, this is Anand against Radjabov from Linares 2009. So white plays bishop d3, developing his bishop and actively playing prophylaxis against the pawn break f5. It would generally be unfavorable to allow black to play f5 because opening the position would be nice for the bishops. And you'd like to, especially this bishop on g7 is really tied down and the pawn on f6 could be weak in the long run. So Radjabov plays knight e7, looking to exchange off this powerful knight on d5. And that's exactly what happens. White takes, queen takes, castles, castles, and now c4 from Anand. So white is hoping to use this move to put pressure on the black queen side and to help get the white knight on a3 back into the game. At this point, c takes b5 is threatened. So that would win a pawn. And black has two ways of dealing with this. One, he could take on c4, but then after knight takes c4, the white knight comes to e3 next, looking at the critical f5 and d5 squares. It could also come to b6. And in general, this is not favorable because it seems very likely that this knight will trade for the white squared bishop, and then we'll be left with this great bishop who can come to c4 and then d5, put pressure on the king side, put pressure on the a6 pawn, against this terrible bishop on g7 who really has no future, and f5 and d5 will be totally impossible. So this would be very undesirable for black. A better alternative would be the move b4. But then after knight c2, gaining a critical tempo on this b4 pawn and say a5, the knight still comes to e3. And while it's not quite as effective here because white was unable to exchange the c4 pawn for the b4 pawn, it still should be quite pleasant for white. So as a result, Radjabov plays f5, looking to immediately counterattack in the center. Queen f3. So white did not want to take this pawn just yet. Presumably, he was concerned about counterplay after a move like d5 and say e takes d5, e4. With opening up this bishop to take b2 and fork the knight and the rook, while this bishop's attacked on d3 as well, it looked like black was able to open the center too fast and activate his pieces too effectively. So instead, white plays queen f3, with the intention of leaving the tension here, and if something like takes, white will be quite satisfied after knight takes c4. So Radjabov plays d5, which has been played before, and not without some success. C takes d5, and now we see the point. It looks like black simply gave up a pawn, but in doing so, we still left this knight on a3, unable to come to c4, and after the strong move f takes e4, bishop takes e4, we notice that black has it within his power to play f5, which wouldn't really be as effective if the white bishop could simply just plant himself on the d5 square in front of the backward d6 pawn with a check and gaining a tempo. So the pawn sacrifice certainly has some positional merit. Unfortunately for black, f5 isn't quite playable yet because after d6, f takes e4, d takes e7, white is conveniently attacking the rook on f8. And of course, if the queen were to capture here, white simply collects the rook in the corner. So f5 is not possible yet. Black plays rook b8, hoping to prepare f5. Now, Anand started with rook fd1, which is definitely not the only move in this position, but we'll just go with it for the moment. So f5. d6, and again we notice that this would fail on account of d takes e7. Queen f6, bishop c6 from Anand, hoping to get d7 through, which would win the bishop on c8, so Radjabov naturally reacts with bishop e6, and now the white retreats the bishop to d5. So what's going on here is white has an extra pawn, black has some space in the center, but black's also weakened his kingside. And white is trying to get rid of black's active pieces because in the long run, white will still be able to generate an attack against this weakened black kingside if he can trade enough pieces that his rooks in particular can get into the game. And really the knight on a3 is the problem piece at the moment. Okay. Rook b d8 played by Radjabov, just simply looking to target the pawn on d6. So now queen b3 from Anand. And Radjabov has to be careful here. If he plays sort of the natural move, rook takes d6, this fails, because after bishop takes e6 check, queen takes e6, rook takes d6 would clip a rook. And if rook takes, white has rook d6 with the pin, and if black saves the rook after a strong move, rook takes a6, white has won a clear pawn and will soon pick up a second one on b5. So this would be greatly undesirable for black. So rook takes d6 isn't playable just yet, so bishop f7 from Radjabov. And here we see some of the depth of what Anand does. He probably, if he was willing to go through a ton of convulsions, could hold on to this pawn on d6, but he would give black a lot of counterplay. Same move like queen b4, trying to hold the d6 pawn, but black just plays e4 and opens up this diagonal. White would have to play something passive like rook b1, and I think very quickly black could get a dangerous initiative. Instead, Anand just endeavors to improve his pieces and look for attacking chances. So knight c2 is played, and he's voluntarily giving up the pawn on d6. But now we see a problem, and that's that after bishop takes f7 check, rook takes f7, rook takes d6, queen takes d6, we've had some mass exchanges, knight e3. This rook on f7 is now pinned, the pawn on f5 is hanging, and white's ready to start bringing the rook into d1 and try to use some avenues to attack this black king on g8. So already black has sort of a dilemma about what to do with this pawn on f5. For example, a natural move like queen g6 would run into a4, which seems pretty problematic. If black were to play f4 here, knight to d5 threatens knight e7 check as well as simply taking this pawn. So black would likely be forced to capture here. Now after a simple queen takes a4, we're noticing black has some trouble defending a6 properly. Like for example, if rook here we have knight d5, and rook e6 now is forced, which is really awkward, and after something like queen d7, it looks like white has a really strong initiative. I'm sure he has other options as well. In any case, after knight e3, black chose to play f4 directly. And then after white's strong move, rook d1, queen g6, knight d5, we're seeing that white's pieces are all very nicely centralized, and he's hoping to start conducting an attack against the weakened black king side. Principal threat is knight to e7 check, so Radjabov defends with bishop f8. A strong multi-purpose move, controlling the e7 square and hoping to bring this passive g7 bishop, who's just kind of biting on his own pawn on e5, around to f8 and then c5, where he could potentially pressure the white king side. f3 from Anand is very strong to prevent e4 from gaining too much space, and we'll see that this knight will actually relocate to e4 in the near future. So king h8, bishop c5 check might have been another option, king g7, and white black just hopes to put the bishop on d4, and then he shouldn't be too much worse. King h8 though is natural, unpins the rook. Knight comes back to c3, as I previously mentioned, hoping to come to e4. But very quickly we realize that black's actually in some trouble here. So after rook g7, which was played in the game, and a very serious error, I wouldn't say black's position's lost yet, but he has to be very careful. Bishop c5 check was called for, and after king f1, bishop d4. And it's difficult for white to really get too much going, because after knight e4, his king is probably a bit safer than black's, and his knight should be better than the black bishop. But the real problem is after rook c7, that this rook doesn't really have an avenue into the game, because black controls the open c file, and the d file is conveniently blocked by the bishop on d4. So, but after rook g7, rook d2, check, bishop d4, knight e4. Black tried the same thing, but after rook c7, we could have had this exact same position with this white rook on d2 back on d1. But as is, this means white gets rook c2 in. And as soon as, even with an exchange of rooks, like we're seeing going to happen very soon, once this white takes control of this open c file, and the black bishop is left in defense of the king on h8, we're going to see some very serious difficulties for the second player. So black naturally played rook c6, looking to avoid exchanging on c2, which would bring the white queen back and then able to come in. Now, should the rooks be exchanged on c6, it will be on black's terms. After queen takes c6, black controls the c file, and, well, he could even think about playing for advantage at this point. So queen d3 from Anand, just a natural move. King g7, b3. So before white takes any serious actions, he just makes sure all of his queenside pawns are on white squares so they can't get harassed by this enemy bishop on d4. And very shortly we see the point of white's play. g4, excellent. So this is a multi-purpose move. Positionally, it's excellent. If all the pieces were exchanged now, white would have a winning advantage because he could just put the king on e4 and play h4, and these pawns on h4 and g4 would basically act as a protected passed pawn, while the pawn on e5 would just be backward. It also will leave white with a passed pawn, especially in a knight against bishop scenario. So this really forces black to play f takes g3. But we'll see very quickly that after f takes g3, white will play g4 again, and then that will leave the g3 square available to the knight, which previously was controlled by the f4 pawn, and the knight can then come to squares like f5 and h5 and really start the attack going. So at this point, we've opened lines toward the black king, which has been the theme of our entire series, but it's a little different this time because we have to take care of our own king too, because he's also on the king side. But luckily, the superiority of our knight over the bishop, both as an offensive and defensive piece, will prove to be black's undoing. So queen e6. Anand naturally has no intention of allowing this queen to invade on h3, so he simply plays king g2. Queen c8. So Radjabov has by force taken the open file from Anand, but after a simple capture in queen d2, we notice that all the key squares, c3, c4, c2, c1, that black could use to invade are very effectively covered by the white pieces, while in the meantime white has clear avenues to try to start kingside play. So white's just going to play g4 on the next move and then knight g3. Try to get the knight to f5, target the h6 pawn. If black were to play h5 himself to try to stop g4, white can simply play queen g5 check, queen g6, queen e7 check, queen f7, queen d6, and white will likely start to pick up some material. These pawns on the queen side are falling very quickly, and black doesn't have any threats at all toward the white king that could really be serious. So after something like queen g6, queen d7, queen comes to c6, queen g6, let's say knight d6. And already here it looks like black's simply losing the a6 pawn. And we're very conveniently controlling this check on c2. And if the black queen runs too far away, well, he can quickly get himself mated. So Radjabov decided not to play h5, which would allow the queen to invade, but after queen e6, there was still a very serious problem on the king side with g4. And while this bishop on d4 looks nice and centralized, it actually doesn't really contribute anything to the defense of the black king. Queen c6, back, kind of aimless, while white simply improves his position, knight g3, king h7, knight f5. So I'm not sure Anand is too interested in this just yet, but he could very seriously consider taking on d4 and just trying to cash in his attack for an extra pawn in a queen endgame at some opportune moment. So perhaps that will partially explain Radjabov's next move, bishop b6, withdrawing the bishop from the d4 square. So queen d3. Anand now has the threat of knight to e7 check, using this discovery on the king. Queen to g6 would be ineffective on account of queen to d7 check. So Radjabov plays king h8, but very quickly we see how bad things can get. So queen e2, attacking the pawn on e5. And it's actually very difficult to find an appropriate defense for him, because the queen in particular is tied down to the defense of the h6 pawn. So bishop c7. Now queen d2, king back to h7. So Anand hasn't made any huge progress in the last couple moves, but we'll see quickly that his pieces jump to life very fast. So knight e7. And we're really noticing the superiority of the knight over the bishop, just because it can hop around everywhere, and now queen d3 is on the agenda and whatnot. So queen c5, queen d3 check, king h8, and now queen d7, a very strong move. And fortunately for white, his king has a safe hiding square on h3, so if black were to play queen c2 check, simply king h3, and black is out of checks and out of luck. Queen e8 is going to end the game. So black tried e4, sort of a desperate attempt for counterplay, but after simply queen e8 check, knight f5 check. I should point out king h7 was impossible on account of queen g8 mate. But just knight f5 check now, keeping it simple, and queen takes e4. White simply has an extra pawn now, and the centralized queen means that he'll never have to worry about any kind of mating threats. And in addition, the black king is still wide open. So bishop b6, king h3, just getting out of the way of queen g1 preemptively. Now, if black were to try to invade to g1 or f2, there's a mate in 2 with check, and then queen g7. So Radjabov tried h5, but things quickly got bad. Anand certainly could just keep his pawn with a move like knight g3, but he decided to play for mate immediately with g5 check, drawing the king out to g5, and now after knight e7, well, the black king won't be along for this world. So the game concluded king f6, knight d5 check, king g7, queen e5 check, king h6, queen f6 check, king h7. And of course, white is completely capable of simply collecting this bishop on b6 and being a piece ahead, but Anand was even more ambitious. He played queen f7 check, and after king h6, knight e7, on account of the threat of queen to g6 mate, which seems basically unstoppable, Radjabov decided he had enough, and he resigned. So we're seeing here that Anand was very patient and just kind of used his better pieces to attack the black king, and this was made possible because the black king was opened up by an inferior pawn structure, and in particular the inferior pawn structure kept the black bishop out of the defense for a long time. So again, this video was different from the rest of the series in the sense that white castled kingside, but I think it's still a very instructive way on how to deal with these Sicilian positions, in particular the Sveshnikov, where you don't really have the opportunity to castle queenside. So I believe this will be the final installment in the series. It's certainly been a wonderful experience recording it, and first video series. Hopefully it will be well received, and I hope that all my viewers enjoyed and learned from the games I presented. So best of luck to everybody, and thanks for buying this DVD. This is Sam Shankland signing off.